Hello everyone, today we talk about the Duchy of Austria between its creation in 1156 and its recognition as Archduchy in 1453. In German, Herzogtum Österreich essentially was a principality of the Holy Roman Empire established through the Privilegium Minus, right, when the Margraviate of Austria, it was called before in Latin sources Osterreichi, was detached from Bavaria. We made a video about medieval Bavaria recently which explained this, and elevated, as we just say, to a duchy in its own right in 1156 as a form of, as we'll see now, partly of compensation of the Babenberg dynasty that up to that point had been loyal to the imperial cause, but also in fact a sort of depletion of the same Bavarian power that at that point was threatening the Hohenstaufen rule of the same empire. And even though we associate medieval Austria in general with the Habsburgs, and well deservedly so, in this first properly high medieval part of Austrian history, the ruling dukes were the House of Babenberg, that eventually extinguished in male line for the eventually Austria to be battled over from by the Bohemians, the Hungarians, and the Germans, the latter of which, with the Habsburg dynasty, rose to the ducal throne finally, let's say for good, in 1276, after having passed, in fact, under the rule of other dynasty temporarily. And Austria thus became the patrimony and at least the symbolic ancestral homeland of the dynasty and the nucleus of the Habsburg monarchy that actually was originary, as you know, from Swabia instead. And that was, especially from the second half of the 14th century, split, however, in its, the dynastic sum of possessions that didn't include just Austria but also other surrounding lands, and still the ancestral Swabian ones, would be in fact split in two lines, the Albertian and the Leopoldian one, up to Frederick V, who reunified all the Habsburgic dynastic possessions. And we conclude today with its history with, in fact, the recognition of the archducal title of the Austrian rulers in 1453 that had been essentially fabricated by Rudolf IV with the Privilegium Maius of 1359, kind of responding, as we have just seen recently in the video about the Golden Ball, as a response essentially to the Luxembourg's political institutional settlement of Central Europe, and especially the exclusion of the Habsburgs, in spite of their great power, which the Duchy of Austria represented definitely the core, from the elective rights in the empire. And this title was in fact officially acknowledged by the same Habsburgs once they became emperor with the aforementioned Frederick V, actually Frederick III, as Holy Roman Emperor. So just to give a broader look at the land, as I was saying before in the video about medieval Bavaria, we already traced what were the boundaries, in fact, of Austria itself, as included historically within those territories east or below, as it was said, the Enns tributary that had been created at the time of Charlemagne at the expense of the other Khaganate. So initially this was a small area, right? It comprised essentially what is modern day Lower Austria, right? So the area of Vienna fundamentally. And it was made as a border mark, located in fact in the eastern periphery of the empire, hence the name of Österreich, so the easternmost Reich, as a power in this general state, but stressing importantly, it's also its strategic importance and military role. In fact, as a margravate, as on a military frontier, that was crucial also to at some point later on expand further east and contending the area to the Hungarian power and also the Bohemians. Was always pretty tormented, in this sense interesting area in its boundaries from a military historical point of view. And it was located essentially, straddled on the northern southern shore of the Danube. It bordered north with Bohemia, with the fortifications along the Thaya river, such as Drosendorf, Rabs, La, theater, in fact, of important sieges historically. So north of the historic Waldviertel and Weinviertel, that were respectively northwestern and northeastern regions. As today of Lower Austria, there was also more evident geographical boundary with the Duchy of Bohemia that was elevated to a kingdom eventually in 1198, so just after the same elevation to Duchy of Austria, that is the Mannhardsberg range. It also bordered with Moravia, and both Bohemia and Moravia, as you know, were ruled by the Czech Przemyslid dynasty that in fact interfered always importantly with Austrian policy. In the east, you find present-day Slovakia, that at the time was part of the Kingdom of Hungary, but it enjoyed this kind of autonomy that it played on at a point. And the boundary shifted gradually towards the plains of the Morava River, right, and the eastern rim of the Vienna basin. And on the right shore of the Danube, so in the south, the boundary with Hungary was the Leitha River, that would remain so historically for centuries between the empire and Hungary. Also, in the southwest, Austria borders the Styrian lands, which were likewise elevated to a duchy and would be unified at a point with Austria in 1190. Well, by it there would be further splits, and still they are essentially two different lands that were at a time named as part of Austria, but weren't quite historically. And if you think about it, Austria is a recent historical creation, because it's essentially emerged from this administrative repartition in the High Middle Ages, essentially after a partial Germanization of the land. The country was originally inhabited by the Celts, then it was conquered by the Romans, and so it was part essentially of the Danubian frontier that made these lands not actually particularly developed, right? There were some ones, the only exception on the Danube being Maesia, right, as a rich agricultural land. The others being fundamentally militarized and not even so deeply Romanized. The most important city, Vienna, being actually unknown in its history in detail for up to the 12th century, right? So areas that remained also relatively in this east that at a point was also in fact overwhelmed by powers of the steppes. The area was settled by several Germanic peoples, but from the 6th century onwards it was occupied by the Avars, as well as the Slavic tribes that were migrating under their guidance, so much that the latter founded the independent Principality of Carantania in the south. It will also become the Mark of Carinthia later on, as still part of Bavaria by some administrative reorganizations. The Avar Khaganate included most of what would be in fact later Austrian Mark up to the Enns River, and that was in fact the historical border with Bavaria itself, right? Where Bavarians one side and the others from the other. And it even was under brief control of Samos Empire in the around the mid 7th century, and eventually passed under Frankish control when the Carolingians conquered the area and established the mark right around the year 800, when Charlemagne had won several victories against the others. The mark comprehended the region between the Enns and the Rab rivers. Was known in fact as the Avar mark, right? And as a smaller part of the Marca Orientalis of the empire. So this was a margraviate, right? That was in fact entrusted with these important military tasks, and it was a perilous area, so much that when the Magyars defeated and exterminated actually the Bavarian nobility at the Battle of Bratislava in 907, the area was taken over again by the steppes rulers that kept it under control up to their reverse at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, when Otto I of Germany re-established the Bavarian Mark of Austria that would remain in the empire for good, right? And the Magyars never, they did come back with some raid, etc., but on the long run, also with the history between Germany and Hungary, but the land was settled under German control. It's at that point, 976, that Emperor Otto II enfeoffed the Babenberg Count Leopold the Illustrious with the Austrian Margraviate. Right? Today we don't see that part of Austrian history. It's a couple of centuries. We don't even know exactly where the Babenberg originated from. Right? They were probably, so maybe the name hints at that, part of the previous Luitpolding dynasty that had fundamentally followed the last Carolingian rule in Bavaria. It was, in fact, in Eastern Francia, actually the most important land up to essentially the Battle of Pressburg, right, and the turmoil that eventually the Magyar invasions would bring to Germany, the rise of the Saxons, the importance of Franconia, etc. But the southeastern part of Germany, as we've seen, properly as was Bavaria at the time, that included even parts of northeastern Italy up to the Adriatic, etc., and that in fact would always maintain that kind of horizons, at least in the broader political interaction between Bohemia, Hungary, Italy, Germany, etc., was an important and concurrent power, right? This was evident already at the time of the Ottonian dynasty, when the Bavarian branch was kind of opposed to the Saxon, but it would be evident under the Swabians, also under the Franconians, because Bavaria would always re-emerge. The Duchy of Austria emerged from this engineered disarticulation of Bavarian stem duchy at the hand of the imperial dynasties that tried to curb its power. In these 2 centuries before 1176, essentially Austria enjoyed an important revival, let's say, due in part to the Ostsiedlung. These were still kind of frontier areas, but as you know, the Germans were expanding towards the east as colonists, merchants, also as feudal lords, sometimes even in other countries, but kind of Germanizing the local culture. And the general recompaction of Germanic imperial power up to the peak being the second half of the 12th century would essentially expand further east. The imperial pressure also on Hungary, right, and making of Austria a very important bulwark of German rule, and in the process also the Slovaks and the Slovene lands were Germanized, right, in part included in the Germanic area, right, and still somewhat entering their sphere of influence, right. Slovakia in part because it was trying to escape the Hungarian pressure that was kind of more oppressive in a way for them, at least, and we can see it also in Slovakian material culture that, in arms and armor is very Frankish looking. The Slovenes, simply because they were a small power between southeastern Germany and northeastern Italy, and therefore they were importantly absorbed at some point, remaining always in their frontier area, an important meeting point probably of the German, Slavic, and Hungarian culture especially, right, and interfering also with the surrounding lands. Now, the House of Babenberg came to rule at some point these areas intermittently, right? At some point there were, as we'll see now, probably Bavarian dukes, right, and also Austrian dukes at the same time. And they ruled Austria up to 1246, when their line went extinct. The Babenberg fortune in our period is mostly connected, practically almost until the very end, to the loyalty towards the imperial house and the Hohenstaufen in particular. In fact, they were related and pursuing generally anti-Welfen function. Right, the struggle against the Hohenstaufen would occur just in the very last years of the same, before the extinction of the same dynasty. The Margrave of Austria, so before the elevation to the duchy, Leopold the Generous, 1136-1141, had importantly supported the Swabians against the Bavarians. So much that in 1139, after King Conrad III of Germany deposed the Welf Duke Henry the Proud, he gave the Bavarian duchy to his half-brother, the Margrave Leopold. Conrad III was the first ruler of the first monarch of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and his mother was the Agnès, right, of the daughter of Henry IV, the Franconian. So, from the marriage with the Hohenstaufen was named also Frederick. He married her at 14, right? And as it happened often, she to this young woman, that she remained a widow eventually, and she married eventually, in fact, the father, the Margrave of Austria, the father of Leopold, right? So hence the blood tie and the common descent from the Franconian dynasty, and the Swabian one of both in fact of the Babenberg, right, with the Hohenstaufen is obvious, it's self-evident. Leopold's brother and successor, Henry II Yazomercot, was enfeoffed with the same Duchy of Bavaria in 1141. And in 1156, the Hohenstaufen Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, having come to the throne with this reconciliatory policy, essentially of uniting both the Swabian and Welf bloodline, was to compromise with the Welfen, with making this alliance with his cousin Henry the Lion, and to maintain essentially this Franconian, Swabian, and Saxon Bavarian axis, for which in the same year, the imperial diet in Regensburg, Henry Yazomercot had to renounce the Bavarian Duchy in favor of Henry the Lion. It's at this point that the Babenberg were compensated with the elevation of their Margravate of Austria to a duchy, right? And together with the granting of numerous privileges that were in fact issued with the privilegium minus, so no privilegium minus in Austrian historiography, to distinguish it from the Deed Maius of 1359, eventually sanctioned 1453, on September the 17th. And this naturally shows the Swabian goodwill towards the Babenberg, who, as one of the most powerful houses in Germany, had a very relevant political and institutional function, right? Henry Yazomercot is a very fascinating character. He fundamentally is the one who made of Vienna the favorite residence, right, at the site of the later Hofburg Palace. At that point, Krems, Klosterneuburg, Melk could all equally rise as, say, capitals of Austria. This time it wasn't quite even the conception of a capital. The same Vienna wouldn't factually be up to the 16th century in a fully recognized fashion, at least. These changes were relevant. After all, the city was already the most important in Austria, and as we will see, the same Babenberg had a very important connection through the Danube with the Byzantine Empire, right? Participation to crusades, marriage in the Byzantine imperial houses, etc. Henry also founded the Schottenstift Abbey as the Babenberg proprietary church, that is built on the private ground of a feudal lord, which he retains proprietary interests, right? And also this international connection with the Irish monks, etc., is fascinating. This time, the Austrian lands prospered, right? They became one of the most powerful feudal states in Europe, as the Babenberg were very good administrators. They exploited successfully many opportunities that presented to them, were very active internationally, and were enjoying at that point the advantages of being loyal to the Hohenstaufen and then participating in a sense in imperial grandeur. And the Danube, as we were saying, was just very important for trade as a waterway from Krems and Mautern via Vienna, right, connecting with Hungary, Constantinople. That's where, after all, some other goods from the German hinterland. Think about Salzburg, that takes this name because it exported salt mainly to the Constantinopolitan markets, had to pass through Vienna. So this was an enormous asset that the dukes knew how to exploit. And there were great figures such as Leopold V, the virtuose, that is mostly famous for his participation in the Third Crusade and the quarrel with Richard Lionheart, whom he took prisoner and kept in jail in his castle on the Danube of Dürnstein. It's very beautiful just also to visit. These were great feudal lords, right? Henry II Yazomercot also was. These were all great tournament practitioners. The same Leopold V died in a tournament accident, right? He had essentially his foot amputated with 3 axis blows, eventually died of gangrene. Already his father actually had died in a similar way, as he had stepped on a rotten bridge near Melk, this had his leg broken, and he died of the consequences of that as well. Leopold V was the son of Theodora Comnena, right? That Henry had married in second marriage, and this was, Henry also is a fascinating figure. He participated to the Second Crusade with Conrad III and Henry VII of France, and Conrad was there with his nephew Frederick Barbarossa, and Henry was also, as we have seen, because of the blood ties before, essentially Frederick's uncle. They both fought at the Battle of Dorylaeum against the Turks, who were both under the arrow shower of that terrifying day, where still the Christians won through. And the Babenberg court was really prosper. They were, by the way, married into various dynasties, including the Montferrat. They're still, they really were important. They were big wigs in international scenario. Leopold VI, the Glorious, also is one of the great knights of the time. He was the son of the Queen of Hungary, and he would marry the Byzantine princess himself, and he ruled between 1194 to 1230, participating to the Reconquista, the Albigensian Crusade, the Fifth Crusade, and establishing, in fact, a reputation. He was also founder of monasteries, and he would die in San Germano, near Rome, while he was there to settle, to negotiate a peace between Frederick II, because those were the times, in fact, and the Pope, right? So, again, very relevant characters. Leopold's court was also known as a center of the Minnesang, right? Some relevant names such as Walter von der Vogelweide, Neidart von Reuenthal, and Ulrich von Liechtenstein were active there. Also, the Nibelungenlied may have been written in Leopold's court. So again, a thriving center from an economical, cultural point of view under the Ducal dynasty. In 1186, the Babenberg signed the Georgenberg Pact with the first and last Ottokar Duke, Ottokar IV of Styria, which entailed that at the Styrian Duke's death, which occurred in 1192, the Styrian lands would have not been just acquired by the Austrian dukes, but they could have never been separated from Austria, right? And it's considered a Styrian Magna Carta because naturally Styria remained as a land on its own, and the prerogatives, the autonomies of the local ministeriales, so these servant knights that were quite popular in Germany because were used by local lords without having to, let them inherit their own fiefs when they granted to them. And they were especially numerous in southern Germany, right up to 90%. In fact, in areas like Swabia, Austria, etc. It would have been, in fact, maintained by this agreement, right? And in fact, Austria and Styria would remain in personal union until 1918, in virtue of the Georgenberg Pact, or a castle on the end on the Georgenberg mountain, in fact. And the Babenberg at this point also expanded their territory into the old Bavarian lands west of the Enns River, exploiting the decadence of the Welfen dynasty, as also, generally speaking, the one of the Hohenstaufen in a way, and especially along the Traun to the city of Linz, so the future capital of Upper Austria. In fact, still today the second, actually the third largest city in Austria. The other being Graz in Styria, but in fact being at the time part of the other land. As you know, at this point, the troubles for the empire would start really with the usurpation of public rights, etc. But let's make a step backwards a little bit, talking about Duke Leopold V. right, and the matter with Richard I, because it's interesting. In 1191, Duke Leopold V joined the Third Crusade, because at the time Frederick Barbarossa had died, Henry VI was ruling, but Leopold de facto became the commander of the German contingent in the expedition that saw also the French and English presence there. And Leopold also distinguished himself at the Siege of Acre. It was eventually successful, and because of this, he claimed that an equal repartition of the spoils between the French, the Germans, and the English, something that Richard the Lionheart refused, because he and Philip II were kings, whereas Leopold was just a duke. And famously enough, the English king threw Leopold's Austrian banner in a sewer. That was a big mistake. Eventually the French sided with the Germans at that point, because they were not naturally very sympathetic of the English cause at that point. Philip II, Richard Lionheart, had been at war. The affairs of their countries were often settled with arms, and so the French essentially blockaded the Levantine ports for Richard to come back home. That Richard had arrived there, also being shipwrecked in Cyprus. He had lost his treasure at some point. It was quite a journey, so he had to come back home by land, which by the time of the Third Crusade was already outdated and a great waste of time, a great risk, because the sea route was actually safer. Well, so Richard took the continental road through Anatolia, the Balkans, Central Europe, just for ending up arrested and abducted at Dürnstein Castle, where he was in fact imprisoned. And he was eventually handed over Emperor Henry VI, who also released them after paying an enormous sum, if I'm not wrong, 35 tons of silver, right? An enormity. And the Duke used his share of the ransom to lay out the Wiener Neustadt fortification near the Hungarian border. And at this point, according to the legend, the emperor granted Leopold permission to bear the red, white, red colors that became the flag of Austria. It was in fact the Babenberg coat of arms. At that point, as we've seen, the old one had been desecrated by Richard Lionheart, and the story, that the legend behind the coat of arms, is because Leopold's surcoat was, after the battle, the crusade, soaked in blood. At the point it was entirely red, right? But miraculously a white band appeared in the center, and so that is the story behind the flag of Austria, allegedly. Leopold VI, we've seen, was a famous knight, right, and also sole ruler of both the Austrian and the Styrian lands from 1198. He married the Byzantine princess Theodora Angelina, and later also married his daughter Margaret to Henry the Seventh of Hohenstaufen, son of Emperor Frederick II, in 2025. That marriage was quite important because, as we will see, the bloodline of the Babenberg would actually end with Frederick II of Babenberg. The name there is probably not so random, considering the Swabian proximity. That was essentially Margaret's brother. And Margaret would become heiress of the huge Babenberg fortune. At that time, literally everybody foreseeing this. Of course, Frederick's marriage of his son to Margaret was seen in that function, right? Henry VII actually died tragically. He rebelled to his father. We made a video about that, and he was twice, right? At the point that first he was forgiven, right? He let himself being carried away by the German princes that wanted essentially to usurp the public rights. Frederick II at that point was obliged to issue the Edictum in Favorem Principum, so to essentially opening to this, to the privatization, that disgregation of public power in Germany that he preferred to essentially cash just in exchange of literally selling those public rights and trying to centralize in his beloved Sicily. Rather, even though he was very attached to Germany, especially Alsace, but he had seen exactly by turning the Hohenstaufen dynasty as just one of the main princely competing one, that through that marriage, the Hohenstaufen, if they had not had the tragic and really terrifying, unfortunate end that they basically all the male ones at least underwent, could have united dynastically Swabia and Austria, so securing the Alpine passes and the routes to Italy, and therefore became a major southern German power that could have definitely supported further an imperial dynasty, and maybe relaunching the possibility of Germany actually succeeding to becoming a national monarch. But history would go otherwise. In any case, that marriage was really crucial. The successor of Leopold VI, Frederick II, known as the Warlike, because basically fought with everybody, also with the Hohenstaufen. So that's why the last is the only one who actually took arms against the Swabian house, but also with the Bohemians and the Hungarians that were always kind of problematically at the frontiers. Frederick II is also one of the few Christian princes who successfully engaged against the Mongols, albeit some just defeating some parties that had entered Austria, and he came out and facing them and routed them. He also had this timid just facade support to Hungary before the Mongols were to crush the royal army at Mohi. And he was also, in fact, probably a capable ruler. Just he found himself definitely not in an easy situation, in which lots of different enemies were consolidating at his boundaries, and his major opponents, in fact, were not just Wenceslaus I of Bohemia and Andrew II of Hungary, but it seems the same Austrian nobility, the same ministeriales that traditionally were very loyal to and especially in the case of the Babenberg house, because they had historically counterbalanced the free nobility, right, as servant knights, and now had, however, by the 13th century become properly an estate on their own regard, owning practically all the power in the land, as the Habsburgs would have had to find out, and also what they owe to their victory, their consolidation, power in Austria. Frederick II of Babenberg supported the rebellion of Henry VII against Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, right? So supported his brother-in-law against the imperial cause at that point, hoping to gain something in the process. Of course, the princes in Germany altogether were kind of doing that, so he kind of followed the trail in a way. But this was too much and brought to the imperial ban an expulsion from Vienna of the same Frederick in 1236, who, however, managed to retain control. I don't remember whether he ruled from Klosterneuburg or the same Wiener Neustadt. I don't remember honestly, but he managed still to retain important control. There were different foreigners that managed to take control of Vienna at that point, but not controlling it fully, and kind of did Zanga at some point intervene because of a marriage, but it lasted for a few time until the same Frederick's death at the Battle of the Leitha River in 1246, when he was in fact killed by Bela IV of Hungary, that 4 years before had marched into Austria to reconquer occupied lands, because there was all a dynastic issue at that point for the power and for the rights on the same Austria. It's a bit complex now to digress on, but this definitely shows how this otherwise well administered principality fundamentally was disrupted at this point by this general upheaval that was going on in Germany, of which also other powers were profiting to strengthen their own influence on the land. Consider that Germany, in fact, was becoming ever more fragmented, whereas Hungary and Bohemia, especially the latter, were quite cohesive. So with Frederick II, the Babenberg male line extinguished. And according to feudal law, the immediately heritable fiefs fell back to the suzerain, the Holy Roman Emperor, right? But Frederick was, first of all, in Italy at that point, fighting against the Pope, who was excommunicated. The wars between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines were ravaging the empire at that point, both in Italy and Germany. So the succession to the inheritance, let's say, to the Babenberg fortune was disputed by other powers that could exploit that moment of weakness. And as you know, Frederick II of Hohenstaufen died in 1250, by the way. Also his son, King Conrad IV, 4 years later, right? And this happened only 8 years after the extinction of the Babenberg dynasty, so there was probably not even the possibility of the Swabians to intervene in Austria at that point. And thus the Great Interregnum, we made a video about that, in Germany began. Essentially, for some decades, the German rule was disputed and the princes extended their private power, dramatically usurping the public rights, and nobody was factually able to control the empire. It's at this point that the great Przemyslid ruler, Ottokar II of Bohemia, that was son of King Wenceslaus I, took the occasion to take over the rule in the princeless lands of Austria and Styria and beyond, and succeeding, right? And referring to the Privilegium Minus, Pope Innocent IV was against the feudal principle of patrilineal inheritance, right? That confirmed the rights of Frederick's sister Margaret, the widow of Henry of Hohenstaufen, and not one of his niece Gertrud, who was widow of Ottokar's the elder brother Przemyslid, Margrave Vladislav of Moravia, who died in 1247. So there was a struggle actually between the two women, who were supported by different powers and also backed by their spouses. So much, in fact, that in 1250, when Gertrude's second husband, the Margrave Hermann VI of Baden, Zenka, died, Ottokar II felt, free, let's say, to invade the Austrian lands. And he was acclaimed by the local nobility. He had an important support of Vienna as well, the merchant class that served as an important logistical base also to wage war against the neighbors, right? Ottokar married the same Margaret that was about 30 years older than him in 1252. And King Bela IV of Hungary contested this because he observed that Gertrude's third marriage with Roman Danilovich, that was a prince of Black Ruthenia and was related to the same Bela, provided the Hungarian crown with a right of succession. Thus, he occupied the Styrian lands, and that's where the Austrian support was fundamental, because together with the Bohemian one, Ottokar prevailed over his foes at the Battle of Kressenbrunn, where the Hungarian army was defeated. Ottokar, by the way, had become King of Bohemia in 1253. He found himself now sole ruler of Bohemia, Moravia, Austria, and Styria. Right, so something enormous. He was factually the most powerful prince in the Holy Roman Empire at that time. And this sum of powers actually recalls the one of the same modern Habsburg monarchy after 1526. So it would take other almost 300 years before that those lands would have been recompacted under a single dynasty. And Ottokar also expanded his power further. In 1269 he controlled the Duchy of Carinthia, with Carniola and the Vindic March further in the south, reaching also some areas like in northeastern Italy, like Pordenone, etc. So an enormous dominion that stretched from the Polish border. He also interfered in Polish politics, for that matter. He participated to the Baltic Crusade. Königsberg, Kaliningrad is named after him. He is the König of that city. In the Sudate Mountains and the Adriatic Sea in the south. So an enormous power that he managed to consolidate internationally further with the alliance with Charles of Anjou. So essentially entering in the wealth axis that at that point was more like a French one, that the Pope was becoming wary of after having done essentially everything to kill, literally, the Hohenstaufen bloodline, which he succeeded with, the male one, I mean, with the beheading of Conradin of Swabia those same years at Naples. And this is part of the reason why the papacy brought fundamentally an end to the great interregnum in Germany by backing the election of Rudolf of Habsburg to king of the Romans in 1273. And the same Ottokar actually was concurring for that crown originally. Rudolf of Habsburg was known as the Little Count. He was a Swabian count. In fact, it is pretty similar. He had been a faithful of the Hohenstaufen, just like the Hohenstaufen were not very powerful at the beginning, but they had been faithful to Henry IV during the excommunication, etc. The Habsburgs had been faithful to the Hohenstaufen even in the darker hour. Rudolf's brother had died in the war against the Lombard League under Frederick II back in the day. So there was a deep connection between properly the Hohenstaufen imperial legacy and the ambitions of the Habsburgs. Right? Frederick II had also been Rudolf's godfather, and the German princes, fearing the Bohemian expansion in Germany, backed Rudolf, whom they considered just, in fact, a little count, nothing to be worried about. But in 1276, the little count managed, but with the same support of the German nobility, to take away, to strip Ottokar of the entire possessions of Austria, Styria, in the southern lands, and installing himself in Vienna. Right? It was a very heavy blow. It was, the Habsburgs, Rudolf and his son Albert were famous for forced marches. Right? Feints strategically are very difficult to achieve, but they were like thunderbolts. They managed to think, to fool Ottokar into thinking that they were about to invade Bohemia, and instead they swiftly moved to Austria and seized Vienna. Right? Actually, the Bohemian army at that point managed to reach Vienna, and even tried during the negotiations to take out by surprise the German army, but they failed because their supply routes were overly stretched, and the Habsburgs were actually making leverage on the revolt of the Moravian nobility, especially under the Wittogonians, that would later become a famous imperial family, the Rosenberg, that opposed the Bohemian rule in their land. And for 2 years, Ottokar II prepared his revenge, and in 1278 invaded Austria again. At that point, Rudolf didn't have enough support from the German noblemen that at this point had taken away any to him, because he had become enormously powerful, right? All of the sudden, right? So he had just to rely on his few but very good Swabian knights that managed to arrive, that the only force that arrived from Germany in his help, plus the Austrian, Styrian ministeriales that were already not particularly happy of the Habsburgic rule, because whoever would have ruled there would have, squeezed, especially in such dire straits, say the local resources, but that were quite effective and helped him winning the extraordinary battle on the Markfeld in 1278. Is one of the largest knightly battle in history, and a masterpiece and a great proof of the greatest 13th century Western European feudal tactical refinements, where the same Ottokar II was killed on the battlefield, as Rudolf remembered as a gigantic display, moral display, and Bohemia was brought to its heels, and the Habsburgs basically consolidated at that point, as it took a while before they secured entirely their rights on the lands, etc. But that's the moment where the Habsburgs installed themselves in Austria and the surrounding lands, that they would maintain up to the end of World War I. So Rudolf at this point secured further the international situation by marrying his daughter Judith off to Ottokar's son Wenceslaus II, who actually retained the Bohemian throne. Eventually the Przemysl dynasty extinguished in the early 14th century anyway, and the Luxembourgs arrived in Bohemia to create much of a pain in the neck to the Habsburgs for the remaining century, fundamentally. But this is a relevant moment. Rudolf granted the various domains. I say the Austrian domains; it's always Styria is included, but to his sons Albert would become Albert of Germany, in fact, to succeeding his father, and Rudolf II at the 1282 Diet of Augsburg, making them factually the most important princes of the Holy Roman Empire. Right. Also, the right of primogeniture was implemented with the Treaty of Rheinfelden 1 year later to in fact secure a male descendancy that, in spite in fact of the splitting in various branches at the second half, essentially for a century from the second half of the 14th to first half of the 15th century, would have actually ruled Austria and Styria uninterruptedly, in fact, until 1918. And at this point, the Habsburgs had an enormous power, right? When we think, as I always like to say this, that the interregnum was like very disgregative for German power. This is true. This doesn't mean that there couldn't be princes that could augment their power monstrously, like the Habsburgs themselves did, and they were unlucky because between premature deaths and defeats on the field, even though there were also successes there, they could have consolidated an enormous power way before the way they did, and there would have been no split, no, or at least, there might have not been, and so the Habsburgs could have consolidated the power in Germany very strong. The same, Rudolf destroyed 70 castles in the Rhineland to curb the German rebel princes. And so this shows that still at the end of the 13th century, the resources to consolidate a monarchic power in the country were felt, at least by the Habsburgs, and eventually as those who resisted them, as enough, right? The big contraction crisis would occur kind of later, the sedimentation of that, parceled Germany. It doesn't matter how, in fact, powerful the various princely dynasties would maintain, would have effectively not brought Germany to be reunified until 1870. So these are, say, marking moments in European history. At some point, the Habsburgs became formally even kings of Poland. Very few people know that, right? In those same years, if I'm not wrong, the same Albert was named king of Poland, because those other lands further east were kind of more permeable in a way, especially after the Bohemian power had been suddenly, had eclipsed suddenly, even though coming back. After the same Battle of Markfeld, the Habsburg Czech army had to important support of the Hungarians. I forgot to say in that battle of Bela IV, the Cuman, but those came back at that point. Were to march north in Bohemia to possibly even to fight against the Brandenburg army that had fundamentally kidnapped Ottokar's wife, widow, and son, and that instead reached this agreement in favor of the Habsburgs, and Rudolf took, care of the fact of the Przemyslits as well. So very shrewd maneuvers that we will also probably see in some detail, because I may, as you know, I wrote a master thesis on the Battle of Markfeld. In any case, in an alternating swing of power, the Habsburgs cumulated for prestige and consolidated their own possessions during the 14th and the 15th century, mostly revolving around the Austrian one in the southeastern part of the empire. As you know, the Habsburgs would fight unsuccessfully against the rise of the Swiss confederates that inflicted them some of the most atrocious defeat in the 14th century. And so actually the Habsburgs always maintained some areas also in southwestern Germany, but they were importantly depleted, and factually the center of power was Austria, and they were there to stay, and trying to revive that. Albeit some branches, as we will see now were at least installed just to retain control also just on the southwest and tried to restart from there, but it wasn't long lasting. The main areas that were consolidated were across or straddling the Alps, fundamentally. We're talking about the Duchy of Carinthia, the Mark of Carniola, that was initially ceded to the House of Gorizia, and came under and it came under Habsburg rule in 1335. The County of Tyrol, that was ceded by Countess Margaret Maultasch in 1363 to Duke Rudolf IV of Austria. It was also one of the most energetic sovereigns. He founded the University of Vienna, the most important, the oldest, at least in the German lands, and that tried to elevate Austria and its capital properly to the same prestige of Prague, of the rival Luxembourgs at that time were prospering and making of Bohemia and Prague, especially the heart of 14th century Europe, and always creating problems at that point. All these territories together became known as the Habsburg hereditary lands, right? And they were all a dynastic collection, but to make the long story short, sometimes they're referred to in historiography as Austria altogether, but they were not, right? Styria is something else, Tyrol is something else, Carniola is something else, right? The Rudolf IV we just named was also the one who transferred who established his residence at the Hofburg Palace in Vienna in 1358-59, and also forged the Privilegium Maius that he used to elevate himself and the duchy properly as archduchy in the empire. This measure, as we were recalling before and talking about also in other videos, was essentially a response to the 1356, just a few years before, Golden Bull issued by Charles IV of Luxembourg, Holy Roman Emperor, that at that point had accumulated an enormous power in the empire and was also, generally speaking, aligned with the Wittelsbachs, so the Bavarian neighbors of the Habsburgs, against Austria, and that it had created an important. For example, Frederick III of Habsburg had been defeated by Ludwig the Bavarian, Ludwig of Wittelsbach, and taken prisoner. Even in that battle, for example, the tides could have been turned, right? The Wittelsbachs could have been brought to heels, and the Habsburgs expanded decisively their power in the air, at least consolidating much larger power. The complicacy of even just the entire. Think about the fragmentation of the empire at that point and the possible dynastic ties, electoral results, etc., were enormous, right? So history could have really taken another turn. But at that point, the Habsburgs were, let's say, the weaker side compared to the Luxembourgs and their allies, and in the Golden Bull, Austria, by factually being one of the most important lands of the empire, had not been recognized as an elector, as it was sanctioned just as this 7 big ones. And as we've seen in the video on the Golden Bull, properly the entire mechanism was designed to favor the Luxembourgs, also to give something to the Wittelsbachs, but not much, right? Not too much. Also because the same Bavaria had been divided in 4 branches, and this was also partly the excuse that Charles used. So at this point, the Habsburgs, even just if you look at the map, tried to consolidate those territories, as we've seen in southeastern Germany, because they were, let's say, the ones in which they had a greater, could have a greater leverage, because the Wittelsbachs were less powerful than the Habsburgs, and they were dramatically fragmented. At this point, the Habsburgs were not yet fragmented themselves in different branches, so they could exercise this pressure on the Alps and in the southeast. They also intervened in northeastern Italy at the time, even though at the time of Ludwig the Bavarian, that again had won the Habsburgs in battle. At that point, they had been actually brought down, so especially in the beginning, we were talking about the 14th century, and they had not ventured in Italy themselves, unlike the Bavarians did, so much that Ludwig was the only Bavarian emperor at the time, because he had instead successfully at least seized the imperial crown in Rome, albeit he didn't stay in Italy at all. He was just to consolidate his power, and he was the German ruler were kind of Germanized the empire further, saying bailing out of the Italian, let's say, theater to tie the German rule more in north of the Alps and in the policy of those areas. In any case, the Habsburgs maintained always kind of an important role, and other families weren't really having it dramatically easier. Right in the second half of the 14th century, the same Luxembourg suffered, and so these great dynasties came paradoxically together, right, to defend their status as monarchs against their estates, against the nobility especially. In the following 2 centuries, this power was thus retained, but still there were lots of internal agitations. For example, there was a lot of inquisitorial persecution of the Waldensians, notably by the cleric Petrus Zwicker in the late 14th century. There was this important reign of Rudolf IV, as we were saying before, that consolidated, importantly, properly, the role of Vienna as the center of Austria in an international fashion. He also enriched St. Stephen's Dome. He had a great care for also for the art, from culture. Let's say Vienna had maintained that kind of important cultural prestige of poets, historians, etc. However, after Rudolf's death, his brothers Albert III and Leopold III divided the Austrian domains between themselves. Rudolf had essentially come to rule after, say, as a sole ruler de facto, or almost at least, intentionally, after a promise of a shared power with all his brothers, but factually he was the most powerful. Albert III and Leopold III instead agreed with the Treaty of Neuburg of this separation that gave in fact place to the creation of the Albertian and the Leopoldian line. It would not be reunited until the mid 15th century. According to this treaty, Albert retained Austria proper, while Leopold took the remaining territories. And there was a further split of the Leopoldian line in 1402, for which Duke Ernest took Inner Austria. So what was the Albertians were still controlling the Duchy of Austria proper. Inner Austria were instead the Duchies of Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, while Duke Frederick IV became the ruler of Tyrol and Further Austria. Further Austria instead being the aforementioned further outer or anterior Austria, the collective name for those early possessions of the Alps of Habsburgs in the former Swabian stem Duchy of southwestern Germany, including territories in the Alsace region, west of the Rhine, and in Vorarlberg. And as you can understand, this enormous potential that the Habsburgs had remained kind of frozen by the split in various dynasties. Not that the Habsburgs wouldn't actually maintain cooperation between each other, but the political landscape was too complicated to keep this lines kind of together as towards a unitary direction. They all had their problems, and the international situation was also was not that thrilling. It was a moment of generalized crisis, of dynastic issues, political fragmentation, and so on. Wars, like about the Hussites, etc. The Habsburg-Albertinian line in Austria was, however, elevated to the imperial throne in 1438, when Albert V of Austria was chosen as king of the Romans as the successor to his father-in-law, Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg. Mm-hmm. But boom, in fact, the eventually Luxembourg line extinguished, and so the Habsburgs came to rule temporarily also on other lands in the process, because in Central Europe, at least namely, this doesn't mean that they necessarily reached power. They were invited to rule other lands, and it was always the nobility, normally in Central Europe, that dictated their rule. Austria was different because, of course, at least the local nobility was important, but the dukes retained an important continuity. Like, it was more like in a Western fashion, right? In Bohemia, in Hungary, in Poland, things were different at that point, at least, or already more inclined towards an elective direction. I mean, the same Germany was like that, but at least Germany contained this other kind of sub-state that were kind of individually more solid and evolving further, albeit very gradually. Albert V ruled only 1 year, actually, but he was succeeded by his Leopoldian cousin, Duke Ernest's son, Frederick V, right, so we're talking about Maximilian I of Habsburg, father. He had a very long rule, right? He's been criticized in part. People say, he was too unaggressive in that conflict, but he was probably a good diplomat and politician, and in fact managed to reunify concretely all the Habsburg territories, right? In fact, the Albertinian line was extinguished in 1457, with that of Vladislaus the Posthumous, and the Elder Tyrolean line in 1490, after which, in fact, all the former Habsburgic lands were brought under, right? We are at the very end of the Middle Ages, but still, they made it under a single ruler. Duke Frederick was also crowned in 1452 as Holy Roman Emperor, as Frederick III, right? And as such, he formally acknowledged the elevation of Austria to an archduchy 1 year later, because he was an emperor. So finally, what Rudolf IV had issued as just Duke of Austria, self-titling himself Archduke, now could be recognized in the empire institutionally. And the archducal title would have been bestowed upon every other Habsburg prince, and only 2 non-Habsburgs reigned the empire between 1438 and 1806, when Emperor Francis II resigned with the secularization brought by Napoleon. And albeit the early modern Austrian branch of the Habsburgic dynasty would meet with renewed difficulties, and, let's say, consolidated itself just as a major power again in Europe. Let's say it was from the times of Charles V, that, however, controlled many other countries, and that also actually shared power with his brother, that was more connected to Austria, as it was more connected to Flanders and Spain already at that point, until, in fact, the 18th century, right? That's the moment with the massive victories against the Ottomans and the reconquest of many Central European areas that, in fact, were not imperial, even historically, in large part. The Austrian Habsburgs, the ones of Spain would have extinguished, by the way, would have maintained this continuous power since the Middle Ages, without the latter which probably the thing would have hardly been possible, right? There were many other families who were old and emerged even much later as ever greater power. Think about the Savoy, etc. But the Habsburgs have this extraordinary continuity that we can't even trace, if it wasn't for one missing ring of the chain that we don't know historically, to the Romano-Burgundian nobility, right? Even in early medieval times, right? And yet, again, without the important, engineering of properly brought to the creation of the duchy, the Margrave of Austria, and the Duchy of Austria, and the brilliant Babenberg administration of the land, that land base would have probably not existed even. So, as you understand, in these videos we make stretching kind of across the high and late Middle Ages, the trends are always similar, right? There is a moment of great fortune and power between the 12th to 13th century, even part of the 14th, but then a contraction, and then a gradual increase. This is in many ways the history of Europe, right, and of the medieval civilization as such, right? All these European powers fundamentally, maybe with slightly different timing, depending on some factors, but underwent the same exact dynamic, right? And they kind of, at least that dynamic was going on and affecting everybody, and they tried to get through it in a way or another, and some made it, some wouldn't. The Luxembourgs didn't make it, but at some point seemed that they were the most powerful ones. The Habsburgs did, right? Albeit their success was much more fragile, right? Than it seemed, right? Again, this enormous success with the conquest of Austria, but then kind of missed chance to consolidate it further, that I'm convinced was present, right? And even later on, right, if it hadn't been for some dynastic ties, biological events, political mechanisms, very different history might have occurred. And if you think about it, also in the broader picture, like the Duchy of Austria, yes, it's powerful, it's compact, it's well administered, it has an evident center in Vienna, it has the Danube, and also interesting opportunities, especially southeast. But it's still just one of the many at this point. We say, okay, because Austria would emerge from that, yes, but at the same time, as we have seen, this was originally a land created out of scratch, right? It was not a previous people or let's say polity that had created that. It's just spread, let's say, from the militarized frontier districtuation into something that was more politically engineered to properly rise in a feudal time. And so it's one of those lands that also owe to, in fact, more evidently political and military reasons, its success, its existence, if anything. And in the same kingdom of Germany, the fragmentation of powers kind of saved the smaller states, as we've seen. I don't know, in a kingdom like France, this would have, doesn't matter how powerful, and also kind of states within the state, some fiefs were. We've seen Champagne, we've seen Burgundy, etc. These were massive things. In Germany, it was at some point just a puzzle that would never be recomposed up to the 19th century. So all these houses kind of were under threat, yes, but not like an enormous kind of unitary threat that could cancel them, right? They were kind of more fragile because, again, of the aforementioned dynastic issues. This was evident. Another importantly lost chance was the one of Bavaria, that split into 4 branches, 4 lines. The Habsburgs at least just 2, right? But there was no major invasion of the country. There was no major even need properly to venture in that very intricate forest of principalities that, in fact, Germany would remain essentially independent to store, but just hopelessly fragmented into hundreds of states. So eventually the same Habsburgs, in fact, wouldn't create, just like the Prussians, the Hohenzollern, that were also Swabian in origin, create their power on the base much of the German power, of the German land. They created it out of it. They created it in Hungary, in Prussia respectively, in Italy, etc. And this, I think, is quite eloquent because it tells, after all, how also in the late Middle Ages the the establishment kind of settled itself. The Ancien regime kind of, especially in Germany, established this de facto impossibility of taking over the whole system, because all the others would have simply opposed it. Paradoxically, the more the picture is fragmented, not just that at least you have a kind of an hegemonic power, but also it's easier to oppose an hegemonic power rising again. And this is why this dynasties would form their fortune outside of the empire, right? Lands that were historically were not even German, they were not even imperial, practically. At least some were German, but like in Prussia especially at some point. But I don't know, if you think about Hungary or Lombardy, well, those weren't. So it's a very curious history, and yet again, the Middle Ages are that definitive moment in which that trend eventually for the modern age was given. And in fact, I think we think too much of the modern age, right? If you actually look at it, it's as if the Middle Ages in many ways had crystallized in that political map. There wasn't a dramatic expansion. It was just a further consolidation of an order that had been set before, right? And the same Renaissance is actually medieval civilization going on in some way. Alright, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.